Stand Together is proudly sponsored by Allflex Livestock Intelligence. Allflex helps you connect the dots to make complex decisions. Breeding, managing, marketing. Bring it all together with Allflex. Coming up, today's commercial cattle producers rely on the best science to make profitable genetic decisions. International Genetic Solutions offers a powerful answer to that call, bringing leading cattle breeds, businesses, and cutting-edge research to the table. Here we focus on the female by exploring how to raise more productive and more profitable cow herds with cutting-edge genetic selection.
Welcome. We appreciate you joining us for Focus on the Female. Today we're going to have a discussion about how the maternal component of your business can not only meet today's needs, but set you and your family up for success going forward. No doubt, terminal merit, the value add of your particular terminal calves gets a tremendous amount of conversation in today's business. But we all know, in reality, it's the maternal beast that determines if we stay profitable in the long term and if we stay sustainable in our particular farm or ranch. So to that end, we have two experts here to discuss the topic with us. We have Dr. Jackie Atkins, the Director of Science and Education for International Genetic Solutions and the American Simmental Association, and Dr. Troy Rowland from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Jackie.
Chip Kim.
So, the female clearly is the factory of our business. There's a lot of pieces that go into this, but kind of lay the groundwork. What are some of the fundamental components we need to be considering when it comes to just how do we value a female as a long-term piece of our enterprise?
Yeah, so it is a big picture, and we talk about, productivity of the female and whether or not the female is bringing in profits back to the ranch. It is a business. We all love our cows, but they also need to help us make money and survive. Probably the number one trait that will determine the success of the cow herd is fertility, whether or not they are pregnant and having a calf and helping that calf along the way to weaning or whatever else you decide to do with them. And there's an awful lot that goes into fertility. It's twice as important as any other trait when it comes to measuring the success of the cow-calf operation. So there's a number of management factors that will influence fertility. It's definitely a lowly heritable trait, so it has a large environmental effect. Some key takeaways that you can do from a management standpoint are things like assess body condition of the cows at preg check. And if you need to do some adjustment, if you need to add some condition, do that before calving, because her body condition score at calving determines how quickly she comes back into estrus. If she's, needing some nutrients at calving, it's too late. You really need to have her in a good spot by calving. The estrus synchronization protocols that, one, help you reduce the amount of time and labor involved in things like artificial insemination, but two, from a reproductive management standpoint, it helps postpartum cows, it helps prepubertal heifers to start cycling before the breeding season, and that's tremendously helpful. You also synchronize your entire herd or your entire set of heifers to be in estrus on day one of the breeding season. So that just shifts the calving window to really be heavy on the front end of the calving season, which does two things. You have older, heavier calves at weaning, but you also have cows that have calved earlier, and so they have a longer period of time before the next breeding season to recover and be, ready to do it again.
So Dr. Rowan, I want to pull on that management strategy of crossbreeding for a second, because I think a lot of folks sometimes lump that in the area of genetic selection, and clearly it is. They're clearly related. Right. But at the end of the day, that philosophical decision to crossbreed is as much a management decision as it is anything.
So in the context of crossbreeding, we know that crossbred cows are much more fertile, right? Just like Jackie said, the heritability of these traits, the lowly heritable traits, the things that are hard to do genetic selection on, because they're so lowly heritable, those are the ones that we see the biggest impact of crossbreeding on. So things like fertility, cow longevity, health, soundness, all of those things see the biggest bump from crossbreeding and heterosis. So that's a free way for a commercial producer to not only get the added heterosis in weaning weight, but also really reap the benefits on a long-lived, fertile, productive female. So crossbreeding is, in my opinion, an absolute must if you're a commercial cow-calf producer. And there's certainly more of it that we can be doing in the industry. So a thing that I'm passionate about on the extension side, the research side, and I really feel that our commercial cow herds, if you're not crossbreeding, that's something that you absolutely need to be doing.
So let's be honest, if we're somebody who's not been doing a lot of crossbreeding, it can be a bit of a big hurdle, right? There's a lot of things to consider: complementarity, how does this creature align to my basic management and business philosophy? So as I'm making some of those decisions, now we come back to what Dr. Jackie said earlier. Yeah, some of these things are fairly lowly heritable, but still there's clearly a genetic component, right? And so while we have a lot of other things that you described that we have to ponder, we might as well control the things we can control. There's so much in this business we don't have a chance. Let's take the things we can control. So as I'm taking that first step, practically speaking, what are the tools, the genetic predictions, the traits on this long list? If I go to any breed association, there's this list of things as long as my arm, and I get overwhelmed. What are the categories that are relevant to me if I'm really thinking about adding longevity to my cows?
So a couple of things. One, I would take a step back, and before anybody does any study and starts looking at genetic predictions, I would ask people to just pause and think about what they're doing and why they're in this business. What are you trying to do with your business? And if you do that and you think about what your current reality is for that business, all of a sudden you've got the roadmap. So here's your vision and here's where you are today, and now you know what your goals are. And based on those goals, now we can use genetic predictions to really help people achieve those goals. So use the genetic predictions, but give some study to what you're trying to do with it first. For the cow herd, certainly stayability is a wonderful EPD to be studying. There's a number of other maternal traits like, calving ease, maternal calving ease, mature size, milk, things like that are also relevant. And so we would also certainly advise people to use something like an index that captures the maternal component as well if we're looking at keeping replacement females.
So there are a lot of organizations that provide an EPD that you describe, a stayability, a longevity measure as you describe it. Dr. Rowan, more and more organizations are working that way, trying to get some sort of stayability measure. Dig in a little deeper on that topic. Why is it imperative that as seed stock providers and genetic service providers that we're providing that longevity tool to better serve our customers?
So this is a trait that has a lot of environmental impact, right? The environment's going to have a much bigger impact on the expression of that trait. So having an EPD is really valuable when it comes to selecting sires that are going to have longer lived daughters for a couple of reasons. Number one, cow longevity, it's in the name, right? It takes a long time to see if a cow is going to be long lived, right? So doing phenotypic selection, only keeping heifers from cows that make it, say, to 6, 7, 8 years old, right? That's one way of doing it, but it's really not that effective because the environment plays such a big impact on the expression of that phenotype, right? So the ability to identify bulls that are going to be genetically predisposed to have daughters that are going to stay in the herd for a long time is really helpful. And it also allows us to focus that, just like with any EPD, focus that selection exclusively on the genetic component of the trait, right? All of the management pieces that Jackie said at the beginning of the talk here, right? All of those are going to influence a cow's longevity, but a bull isn't able to pass those on to its daughters, right? A cow isn't able to pass that on to her daughters, right? So being able to identify these animals through a genetic selection tool is really valuable because we can select bulls on the front end before they've even had calves that are going to be predisposed to make those long-lived daughters, which is really valuable as we start to think about making quicker genetic progress on this trait that we've identified as really important to commercial cow-calf profitability. So I think that the stayability EPDs are absolutely central to making good, solid commercial females.
It could be considered that if we focus in purely on stay, we're going to have some implications, right? If we do that, we know size, has a huge impact on stay. And so if we just single trait select for stay, while it tells us a lot, it can also provide some dangerous pieces, right? Ultimately, we're going to be selecting for fairly small females, and aggressively over a fairly short window of time, those cattle may not generate calves with a tremendous amount of terminal merit. Is that a reasonable position to take? And so my question then is, while we look at stay, like we always do, a whole host of individual EPDs, is it potentially wiser to consider stay in the prism of some form of index? Dr. Atkins, what's your thought on that?
Yes, we always encourage people to use an index. Single trait selection is just not a good idea because there are correlated traits that might work in an unfavorable direction to that single trait. So putting all your pressure here might drive this other, also economically relevant trait down. And so the indexes provide this nice balance of all of the economically relevant traits, and the ones that we recommend using are a whole cycle indexes because they consider, even for the cow-calf producer, if they're selling calves at weaning, those calves are still going into the supply chain, and the beef quality is still important. So we encourage people to use indexes that consider the entire segment that those genetics will influence, but definitely within an index, using an index that has stayability included when you're looking into keeping replacement females is so important because it's twice the factor of any other trait for success of a cow-calf operation. So we highly recommend using indexes. They help you have kind of a balanced approach where you're still putting emphasis on growth and keeping, mature weight in a responsible place and, emphasis on post-weaning growth and carcass traits are all included in some of those whole cycle indexes.
So, final question, Dr. Rowan. You're constantly having to educate folks at the ground level about some of these things. Are there any other aspects that speak to you about the value of a whole life cycle index? Kind of when you're talking directly to a producer about some of these things that Dr. Atkins just mentioned, are there other components that they need to be weighing as they think about the whole life cycle index? Or maybe conversely, are there more of us at this level who need to be generating whole life cycle indexes?
I think that these whole life cycle indexes are really important, especially when they consider cow longevity in them explicitly. I think about looking at what the dairy industry has done in their selection indexes, right? And we've seen this sort of, monumental trend for milk yield that has sort of leveled off because the selection pressure, they've realized there's much more of an economic value on a long-lived, fertile, healthy cow, right? So redirecting our selection decisions, focusing more on these traits that affect a cow's longevity and her ability to stay productive in dairy herds, right? That's something that we see in that industry, and we're realizing that in the beef industry. When we put pencil to paper and there are economic values for developing a heifer, right? And when you start multiplying that over, a 10% increase in the number of heifers you have to develop each year, the economic value of that is worth way more than a handful of pounds of additional weaning weight. And just like Dr. Atkins said, economic selection indexes are great because we can balance these things relatively, right? There's economists that are way smarter than me that can attach values to these things in the real world in a generalized sense, but these things are also very robust, right? So if you don't perfectly match the situation that these economic values are calculated for, it's still really likely that this index is going to point you towards the right sets of animals. So I think that there's a lot of potential for these whole life cycle indexes to really revolutionize our industry by focusing not just on these terminal traits that are very easy to put a pen and paper value to through that check at the end of the year, but all the other things that contribute to a whole cow herd's profitability over the long term.
Pretty thought-provoking and a great way to get our show started. Thank you both to Dr. Jackie and Dr. Troy, and we will be right back with Dr. Ken Odie from Kansas State University.
Our International Genetic Solutions discussion continues after this. From DNA to EPD to ADG to yield and grade, Allflex helps you capture powerful insight. Seed stock to cow-calf, feedlot to processor. Let's all use data to raise more profitable beef. And while we're at it, you can connect dots on your operation to raise and sell better cattle. At Allflex, we help you bring it all together. Stand Together is brought to you by Allflex Livestock Intelligence, the leader in animal ID and monitoring. From DNA to EPD to ADG to yield and grade, bring it all together with Allflex.
Welcome back to IGS Focus on the Female. I'm here with Dr. Ken Odie from Kansas State University. Not only is Ken a faculty member at K-State, but a longtime serious beef producer back in South Dakota, right, Ken?
That's correct, yes.
So in our last segment, we had the privilege of hearing from Dr. Atkins and Dr. Rowan, essentially about the arc of some genetic components that are important to us. And we're going to talk about some of those things, maybe from an academic standpoint in a second, but I want to talk to a cattleman for a moment. Back on your ranch, back at your place up north, what is the importance of responsible crossbreeding, complementary genetics? What importance do they play for you back home?
I would say it's a big deal, okay? And in fact, I would say it's maybe our highest priority. I call it trying to get heterosis right, okay? And it's not trivial. It's not necessarily easy, but that's one of our big objectives. And so we have a Sim Angus herd, and what we're really trying to do is create the best maternal herd that we can actually create.
So we live in a time when the discussion about terminal metrics is all the rage, and appropriately so. We often forget the impact dollar-wise that the short-term cow can have on our business. She can hurt us pretty hard. What are some of the economic implications you consider both on the ranch and when you're explaining some of these to cattlemen around the country?
So in our program, we're Simmental Angus program. We now have a breed composition through DNA analysis on probably about 75–80% of our cow herd. So what knowing that breed composition helps us do, it helps us do a better job of managing heterosis. Now, why are we really interested in longevity? Well, first of all, fertility is very closely related to longevity, because most of the cows that leave the herd because they fail to get pregnant. That's the number one cause of cows, not just our herd, but that would be any cow herd. That's the number one reason. So the longer we can keep that cow, getting her pregnant on an annual basis and having her produce a calf, the reason that's so important is now we have lower herd turnover rates and we have lower replacement rates. The cost of developing a replacement heifer historically is high relative to the cost of maintaining a mature cow. So our most profitable herds, commercial herds, have low herd turnover rates. And that's a really critical piece that a lot of people don't understand, because there's a lot of people that think, like some seed stock people who should think this way, that turning generations is the key. Turning generations rapidly is anti-profit in commercial cow-calf herds.
So as commercial folks, so some producer who's watching right now, and maybe they've allowed themselves to get way too straight bred on their cows, and they know, whether they'll ever mention it out loud, that their cows aren't lasting like they used to. They just don't.
Yeah.
And they're okay, I need to go there, Dr. Odie, I believe you. What are some metrics that they can put in play on their place? Is it as simple as she stayed or she didn't? Or are there some other steps they can take to help them make this decision as they decide, okay, it's time to go the route that Dr. Odie described, I need to add in a little responsible crossbreeding and heterosis?
First decision to make is, am I gonna raise my replacement females, or am I gonna buy replacement females? In our industry, the history has been most people raise their commercial replacements, but not all do. And I would argue, as we trend in this industry, I think we're likely to trend more to terminal sire programs, and we're likely to trend more to replacement females being acquired. And if you think about that, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we have a very aging rancher population. Okay, so what's the hardest job an old rancher might have? It's calving heifers. So if he can avoid calving heifers, which means he might buy cows as replacements as opposed to heifers, that has a interesting business strategy and could very well, it's already the case for many people, and it could be the case for a whole lot more people. The other point that I want to make, though, is we certainly understand when we sell calves in the sale barn, what those calves brought. In some cases, we know quite a bit about why they brought the dollars they brought. That's a lot of what we do with our superior livestock database, is try to understand why certain calves actually bring more information. Most of those, though, are going to be terminal calves. They're going into feedlots, they're going into finishing areas where the terminal traits are going to actually be important. What I see a lot of producers do, though, is they think terminal, then they see these big heifers, and there is this kind of sense that, man, I need to keep those.
Yep.
Wrong strategy. Wrong strategy. I think creating a maternal cow herd requires dedication and long-term commitment, and long-term commitment to the maternal traits, with far less emphasis on the terminal traits, and that's that's what I would argue the genetic strategy actually ought to be. And it takes a lot of discipline.
Yes.
It takes a lot of discipline, people kind of sticking with it. But I also want to mention that right now, we've been in a trend for a long time where heifer calves are declining in value compared to steer calves. That's largely being driven by increasing carcass weights. Mm-hmm. So what happens is right now, when I sell calves in the fall, my heifer calves, now we keep replacements, but my heifer calves in general are about $150 a head lower than my steer calves. Mm-hmm. So the more I can generate steer calves, the better off I am economically. Plus, when heifer calves are cheaper, it increases the incentive for purchasing replacements as opposed to developing replacements. So there's another kind of incentive in there as well.
So as I'm making some of these decisions, historically, breeds might have looked a certain way, but I think we know over the last 20, 25 years, there have been aggressive selection pressures in all populations for a myriad of different things. And some of those more knee-jerk reaction to, well, I'm going to use X breed to help solve my dilemma, can go back to a thought process of 20 or 30 years ago. Breeds have changed, right? Yep. And we do have to be sensitive that, as you said, size is an impact. And if I'm making those big old stout stomping steer calves, I can't help but be impacting the size and hence the longevity of my cow herd. So how do I evaluate these breeds? How do I suck all that in and absorb that and still make those decisions that can monitor size?
So think about this. If that cow lasts longer, if you have to replace the cow less often, the primary benefit of that is managing costs, is actually on the cost side of the equation, not the production side of the equation. And you have to think that way, because what ends up happening, it also is true that as cows get to be about 8 or 9, their weaning weights aren't going to be quite as good. Okay, the weaning weights will go down a little bit. But if you think about it, if she gets pregnant, she stays in condition, she weans a calf, even if he's somewhat lighter than the heaviest calves in the herd, she's still doing well for you economically. And she's really helping you manage your costs, keep your costs in line. And I think producers need to think about the maternal herd more in terms of cost management.
So Dr. Rowan, in our last segment, reminded us that we need to be using responsible whole life cycle indexes if we're keeping daughters and we're making terminal calves, right? Which, as you said, is the predominant production model in our system. But he was very clear that these indexes have to be well thought out and robust. And no question, to your point, that a well thought out index considers both the output, but if you're not considering input cost,
yes,
then your index is faulty, right? It's leading you in a dangerous direction. And so I don't know if you have any direct thoughts in terms of how those indexes apply in terms of decision making for a rancher.
Absolutely. So I will just tell you, in our AI decision making for bulls, or in our decision making for purchasing bulls for natural service, we rely heavily on API and stayability. So those are the two traits that we put the most emphasis on in choosing our bulls. And we're trusting your organization, IGS, the animal breeders that many are friends of mine, the professionals, that we're getting these indexes right, that we have these indexes properly, that the various traits are properly accounted for in the indexes. And then stayability is, in my view, is the best we have for the genetic side for trying to pursue longevity. Okay, and so those are the two that I would place, that we actually do place the most emphasis on in trying to create and maintain a maternal herd.
And for the listeners, some might not be familiar with the acronym API. So API is an all-purpose index, or specifically is a whole life cycle index, right, for the Simmental population. And so the whole life cycle index in general is the approach as you describe, couple that with the terminal metrics that you can identify.
Yeah.
And so one last question, because of your role off the ranch, you have an opportunity to enlighten some young people on campus and in other places. And one of the things that I know is personally dear to you is when you can catch that 30-year-old couple and give them some strategies, some steps, some tips that we know now that frankly, when we were doing this, right, it was 10 years before you really knew if a cow was a good bet.
Yeah.
Are there any other strategies or tools that they should be looking at to help affiliate some of the things you've talked about?
Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is we are becoming more of a data-driven industry, and we need to become more of a data-driven industry. So the first piece of advice I would give them is just because Joe says it doesn't necessarily make it true, okay? So you have to invest in your own education to really understand, and don't just listen to Ken Odie, and don't just listen to other people, but you have to study and learn. And as you study and learn, you will be making better decisions. Then the obligation is on us, people like those of us that work in universities, people like you that work in organizations like you do, to make sure we're bringing the best science to the table, that we in fact are both building the databases that we need to help make better decisions, and we're committed to those in the long term. That's really important. So I would say, even at this meeting, I've had this conversation with a lot of people who say, yes, we need to get more data driven, but I'm also going to tell you that that's not easy. It's a challenge, and it's expensive. It requires a lot of people time. My group at Kansas State is kind of in that business, so we've been doing this, and we plan to continue this after my retirement from Kansas State.
Which none of us really look forward to anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the IGS Focus on the Female. I hope this conversation has stimulated some thought, and if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at internationalgeneticsolutions.com.
Stand Together was brought to you by Allflex Livestock Intelligence with support in part from Neogen and the American Simmental Association. Learn more at internationalgeneticsolutions.com.